Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Dolan. I'm back here to broadcast for you once again. Took about a week off. I was out with Tracy on an extended vacation. Let me just say, much appreciated. We enjoyed ourselves and just got back a little late last night. And I'm very, very happy to be back here with you. Tracy and I will be back on Tuesday for our weekly show, Intelligent Disclosure. So you can look forward to that as well. Right now, I'm happy to be here to talk about, I've got 2 episodes left in my weekend broadcast live stream relating to the Project Blue Book series on the History Channel. That series is now completed. It's 10 episodes for season 1, but I'm not done talking about each of the episodes. There are 2 to go, and episode 9 is about the really the first true case of alien abduction that we have in the modern era. That is the Betty and Barney Hill case from 1961. I really want to get into that because, first of all, the history of the case, as we know, it is quite a bit different than how it's portrayed in the series, quite obviously to anyone who knows anything about the case. And the fact is that the facts on the ground about the Betty and Barney Hill case are very, very compelling indeed. I think many people do know about this case. It's one of the best known abduction cases ever. Maybe some would say the best known. There, of course, is the case of Travis Walton. That's maybe a little bit better known. But certainly the Betty and Barney Hill case is the one that really got it all started in the public mind. So although, yes, I think in later years, there have been quite a few UFO researchers who have tracked apparent instances of alien abduction going back into the 1950s. And probably even prior. But it's important to understand that before the case of Betty and Barney Hill, pretty much no one knew about any of this, and certainly no one was talking about it either. So their experience, I think, can truly be said in many ways to have initiated our understanding of what we call alien abduction. They weren't the first, but they were the first people to get any real attention, and to be sure, they did not want it. Let me show you a picture of Betty and Barney. I've got a lot of interesting, hopefully helpful images for you just to give you an idea. There they are. That's Betty and Barney Hill. It's around the time of their experience, which happened in 1961. And they were quite active in their community. They were very, very well known in their area for promoting civil rights. And as you can see, they were an unusual example in the particularly early 1960s of an interracial couple. And I mention this because that fact is somewhat significant. I'll get into this a little bit later as well, but in the context of their society, this is a couple that did not want ridicule brought in against them. They were not looking for publicity. Betty was a veteran. Barney was a veteran. Betty was a social worker. These were people who were working really hard to make this world a better place. And that's a great picture of them. So what happened was everything began and happened on September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I'm going to show you a map of that right now. Let's see if I can get that going. There we go. So that's Portsmouth. This is just typical Google Earth stuff that I do every week, as you come to know. And let me just zoom in a little bit more. You can see this is New England. So New Hampshire is right by Maine, right on the Atlantic coast. And there's Portsmouth. All right. So they're in the state of New Hampshire, is where they lived. They were driving at night. And the basic thing is they lost about 2 hours of time without realizing it after having seen a UFO at close range. So let me come back here. And pardon me there. So now it was much later under hypnosis that they gave a very detailed and actually very similar accounts of their experience. And this in turn corresponded very closely to the many abduction claims that followed after their case became known by the mid-1960s. So Betty and Barney Hill, again, were very socially aware, very politically active citizens. And I guess just want to mention this again. Let me share my screen with you if I can do this. Barney was, there we go. Let's share that. Barney's position, he was actually a prominent member of the NAACP. He was the legal redress chairman of the Portsmouth chapter of the NAACP. He was a member of the State Advisory Board of the United States Civil Rights Commission, and he was on the board of the Rockingham County Poverty Program. All right. And I mean, that's just, these are great pictures of him. He also served 3 years in the Army during the Second World War, and he received several awards for his community work. And there's Betty. Betty was a state social worker. She was known for her work with the poor. She also assisted the NAACP, and she was the United Nations envoy for her Unitarian Universalist Church. All right. These are good people here, as you can obviously see. And so again, on the night of September 19, 1961, they're driving home. They had a dog. Their dog's name was Delcy. They're coming back from a vacation, and it's just after 10 o'clock at night. They left a little diner in the town of Colebrook in northern New Hampshire. And let me just show you this image. Again, I want to go to Colebrook. Oh, before I get into that, let me talk about Kathleen Marden. Kathleen Marden is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. And I really must say that if you want to go deep into this case, you must go to her work. Kathleen is, I think, the definitive analyst of this entire case. And she's done, she wrote a definitive book on this called Captured. That's the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, which she co-authored with Stanton Friedman. And I would also recommend going to her website, Kathleen-Marden.com. She's got an entire section on the Betty and Barney Hill case. Obviously, it should be pointed out, Kathleen has done a great deal of additional work on the UFO phenomenon. In addition to this, she's very active with MUFON for abduction/experiencers. But she has a lot on her website about the Betty and Barney Hill case. I strongly encourage you to check it out. And she has spent a lot of energy, I would say meticulously going through where skeptics and would-be debunkers get it wrong on this case. She nails it, in my view. So please go check out her website if you get the opportunity. Her book is very, very good. So let me get back to the map. Colebrook, New Hampshire is in the top part of the state. I was looking for a good map of where Betty and Barney were driving back home. And the routes since 1961, I get a very strong idea, have changed quite a bit. They were, Colebrook, here's, this is Canada, here's Colebrook, New Hampshire, this little circle. Basically what they were doing is going to drive down. This is Route 3. This was the main route. Now we've got a major highway here. They did not take this road, but they went through 3, she points out, Route 3B. She mentions that a lot of people incorrectly pointed out the route that they drove along. They said it was only Route 3 around Squam Lake and the west side of Lake Winnipesaukee, which she points out would have added a lot of time to their trip, but it's not the route that Barney took. He clearly stated that he traveled along Route 3 to Route 3B, which I really couldn't find on current maps. And then to I-93, and I think that's down here, down by Concord. That's a major left turn there, and that takes them down to Portsmouth at the end. So that's the route going all the way down the state of New Hampshire, essentially. So let me get off of that. So in any case, they started this little diner in Colebrook at the top of the state of New Hampshire. About 10 o'clock, a little after, Barney's predicting they're going to get home around 2:30, 3 a.m. at the latest, he says. So shortly after leaving Colebrook, they're driving, and they're puzzled by an object in the sky, and they're basically seeing it as having movements that they consider to be unpredictable. Barney was not a believer in UFOs. He was a self-described rationalist. And he says, oh, it's probably a satellite. Betty's never convinced by any of these explanations. And he says, well, it's probably a star. And they both start noticing that the object is apparently moving. It seems to be changing its course. So Barney says, it's probably just a commercial plane. You're getting way too excited about this, he says to his wife. Betty is not persuaded by any of this at all. So they had binoculars. And she's looking at this thing through binoculars. And she says, this object is silhouetting against the moon, she's believing. And she later says it appeared to be flashing thin little pencils of different colored lights. So very thin, let's say, rays of lights coming out. And she said rotating around an object, which at least at times she thought was cigar-shaped. So Barney's saying, nope, I believe it's a plane. And it's, even though it's changing speed several times to their perception, he did admit, though, that it seemed to be tracking them. And he started wondering, is it playing games with us? So let me show you another map here. And so they get to a place called Cannon Mountain. So they start here. Here's Colebrook at the top of New Hampshire, and they're going down, and now they've gotten this far down. All right, so they're still in the top half of the state. And by the way, you can see this is current Google map. It's very, very green in this area. And in 1961, it was a lot of wilderness, a lot of forested areas. It was very, very, it's a lot of beautiful scenery, but also not a lot of people up there. So they get to a place called Cannon Mountain. They're driving very slowly. And their dog, Delcy, begins to whine and cower. This is a picture of Delcy having a nice time on Barney's lap. There's Betty stroking her. This is after their Publicity came out, and they're taking lots of media pictures. But there she is. She was in the back seat and becoming very, very upset and very scared. So what happens? The object that they're looking at descends very low. At this point, there's no question to Betty or Barney that this is something very unusual and very dramatic. As it gets low, it's down to now a few hundred feet altitude. It became very clear to them that it was huge. Barney called it a structured craft of enormous dimensions. And Betty is noticing a double row of windows. At this point, they were both terrified. So Barney stops the car. He's in the middle of the highway. He just stops the car. He gets out. The motor is still running. The object had swung toward them, and it hovered not more than, he said, 2 treetops away. It was tilted. It looked like a big glowing pancake. I have here a drawing that Barney did after the fact of the craft. This is it. You can take a look at it there. So Betty, he's out there, the car's running, Betty's screaming after him, and he doesn't hear her. So now he's also seeing this double row of windows, and he sees at least 6 figures inside. To him, it looks like they're wearing uniforms. It looks like they're staring directly at him. And he recalled later thinking that one of them appeared to be the leader, but his memory became kind of blurred at this point. So then what happens, this is becoming very strange. He remembers running back to the car, screaming, hysterical. What happened in the interim? He couldn't remember right away. They get back in the car. They're driving again. And the two of them start hearing a very strange electronic type of beeping sound, which seemed to vibrate the car itself. They feel an odd tingling sensation, and they feel drowsiness starting to overcome them. And then some time passes. They didn't really know how much. And then the beeping sound repeated itself. Their consciousness seemed to return. The car was moving. Barney was still driving. Okay. Now at this point, they're in a very different place indeed. Let me show you another map. So they're in, Oh, yeah, let me show you this. This is actually an image that I did find from Kathleen's website, and this is a recreation. So Barney outside, this is actually Barney Hill posing for a photograph later, and then this UFO is superimposed over the image, obviously. And that gives you a general idea of what we're talking about. So then he gets back into the car, he drives, they become drowsy, and they are now, when they come to, they're in an ashland way south of Cannon Mountain. All right. This is 35 miles south of where the first beeping sound had occurred. And then from there, finally at 5 a.m., not 3 a.m., they arrive home, which is in Portsmouth, and that's where they were. So here's the basic markers of the journey. Coldbrook, the diner, Cannon Mountain, where they had the dramatic sighting, Ashland, where they regained their consciousness at some point, losing it along this way here, and then they drove the rest of the way and home. So I'm glad we were able to show that map there. So they get home at 5 a.m. Barney's like, oh, it's a little later than we expected. So immediately, and really without any explanation, Barney felt this urge to examine his abdomen. And he became aware of an unexplained soreness on the back of his neck. He couldn't explain why the tops of his shoes were badly scuffed as well. Kathleen Martin always pointed out when she discusses this case that Barney was a meticulous dresser and his shoes were never scuffed. This was not what Barney Hill did with his shoes. He kept them very, very well polished, but his shoes were not polished at this point. They were scuffed, and he didn't understand that. And he later said, I didn't know why at the time, but I felt unclean was the word he used for it. So the sighting still baffled him, but he continued to maintain that it was some kind of aircraft, in spite of the fact that the aircraft was totally silent and all these other unconventional things about it, like seeing people staring at him from like almost ground level. But anyway, they both agreed, let's not talk about this. But Betty did call her sister Janet, who had also been a UFO witness from some years earlier. So Janet was very interested in the story, and she repeated the story to a neighbor of hers who happened to be a physicist. He said, hey, one thing you could do is just take a compass and take it to the car and see if it shows any evidence of ordinary, out of the ordinary magnetism or any kind of physical effect on the car. Janet mentions this to Betty, who takes a compass to her car. I love it. Back in the 1960s, like everyone had binoculars, everyone had a compass. Who has that now? Betty Hill had a compass, and she takes it out to her car. And, Barney, during all of this, was not in favor of dwelling on the event. But anyway, they both go out there and they take the compass. And when they go to the car, what they notice, first of all, is that there are all of these shiny circles on the surface of their trunk. There are about a dozen of them. They're all perfectly circular. They're all about the size of a silver dollar. And they notice that these circles were highly magnetic. Very interesting. Betty's sister Janet still played a role in this. Her sister described this incident to a former local police chief, friend of hers, and he suggested that the Hills contact Pease Air Force Base, which was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, right where they lived. Betty was, for her part, she was afraid that she had been exposed to radioactivity, so she called the Air Force Base. She's thinking, maybe the Air Force will know something about this. They'll be able to give us some answers that we're looking for, and so forth. And she calls the Air Force, and in this account, she only gives the bare details of the event to the officer on the phone. She doesn't mention, for example, the double row of windows, or like the extreme nature of the UFO sighting was not part of it. She did not mention the shiny spots on their car. And during that phone call, Barney also spoke to this officer, who actually informed him that their call was monitored. I thought that was a very interesting fact. It was interesting that Betty and Barney had very different perspectives on this phone call, incidentally. Betty thought the officer was very cynical, very non-communicative, and Barney said he was very interested. Anyway, the base called back the next day. They wanted to get some more details, but basically that's about all they got. And that appeared to be the sum total of the investigation of the case by Project Blue Book. They issued a conclusion a couple of years later saying there's insufficient evidence to make a determination. Although the author of that report said the object was probably Jupiter. So that was Blue Book's explanation of the Hill case. They said, look, there's no evidence that we know of to indicate that this was anything other than natural causes to their sighting. So Blue Book just closed the book on the Hill encounter. But for now, all right, back in 1961, Betty and Barney are still very intrigued by their encounter. So they decided to draw the object from memory in separate rooms. And their drawings were very, very similar. So Betty decided to learn more about UFOs. She gets interested and she finds a book by Donald Kehoe called The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. This is one of Kehoe's major books on the subject. There it is. I think that was from 1950. No, that was a 1960 book, if I'm not mistaken. And she gets it from a local library. And we're still in September here. She writes to Donald Kehoe. So it's the same month of the sighting, and there's Donald Kehoe. Of course, I've done a lot of podcasts about him. He was really the great UFO investigator of the 1950s. And really, you could even argue one of the top guys in the 1960s. She writes to Kehoe, who's in charge of the organization NICAP. They're probably the most prominent UFO organization in the country at the time. And she's just asking for more information. Then, beginning around the end of September 29th or so, we believe, and remember, their experience had happened only on the night of the 19th, so about a week and a half later, and continuing for 5 consecutive nights. All right. Betty Hill starts having a series of incredible, vivid dreams. Now, these are far more intense than anything she'd ever experienced in her life, and they actually dominated her waking life. They involved, these dreams involved her encountering a strange roadblock on a lonely road. They involved her being approached by a group of men, all dressed alike, as they reached the car. And then Barney's in her dream with her. She and Barney become unconscious in the dream. In the dream, they awaken to find themselves in a strange craft. So it's really an alien abduction dream. She dreams them being given a complete medical examination by intelligent, but not human beings, but humanoid beings, let's say. She dreamed that Barney was taken down a corridor and that both of them were assured that nothing harmful would happen to them, that they would forget everything that happened. This was her dream, her series of dreams. Quite amazing. In the early part of October, 2 more people get notified about this. Their names are C.D. Jackson and Robert Homan. I think they're very interesting figures. I've never really found out everything that I want to find out about them, but they enter the story. They're both very technically trained in electronics industry. They're both members of NICAP, and they were both in Washington, D.C. for a conference. This is where NICAP was headquartered. This is where Donald Kehoe lived. And so they arranged for lunch with Kehoe, who told them about Betty Hill's letter, which he had just received. They were impressed. And they were soon going to be contacting the Hills, as you will see. But meanwhile, the person who immediately got in touch with them or began talking with them was this man. That's Walter Webb, because NICAP contacted Walter Webb. He was a NICAP scientific advisor, and he was also a lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. Very, very sophisticated, well-educated man. They said, would you please investigate the Hill case? He didn't want to do it at first. He was very reluctant. He meets with them on October 21st. So this is about, a month later, really about 1 month after the event. Very impressive how NICAP was able to get on this as quickly as they did. It's really all because Betty Hill took the initiative to contact Kehoe, but then Kehoe himself kept the ball rolling. So I think that's very much to their credit. Anyway, Walter Webb really didn't want to do this, and he felt very confident that he's going to find all kinds of holes in their story. That is not what happened, not at all. He actually interviewed them for 8 hours, and in his words, and this is a quote, long quote, he said, "I was so amazed, so impressed by both the Hills and their account that we skipped lunch and went right through the afternoon and early evening. During that time, I cross-examined them together, separately, together, re-questioned them again and again. I tried to make them slip up somewhere, and I couldn't. Theirs was an ironclad story. They seemed to me to be a sincere, honest couple driving home from vacation late at night on a lonely road when suddenly something completely unknown and undefinable descended on them, something entirely foreign or alien to their existence." So, if anything, Webb felt the Hills underplayed the dramatic aspects of their encounter. So the three of them, they were so caught up with the account that they actually forgot to show him the spots on the car, although they mentioned the spots on the car. They just didn't show him the spots on the car. Meanwhile, Barney was still running up against what he was calling a curtain, and he couldn't get any further than this. So his memories just were not helping. They were stopped. So Webb writes a report to NICAP at the end of October. He gives a lot of detail on the interview. His conclusion, they were telling the truth. As far as Webb was concerned, this incident happened exactly as Betty and Barney Hill claimed. About a week after this, on November 5th, Homan, one of the two, Robert Homan, one of the two guys, along with C.D. Jackson, who had become also interested in the Hill case, he writes to the Hills, and he mentions his interest and C.D. Jackson's interest in their encounter, and just asks to meet with them. And this meeting happens. They meet with the Hills in late November of 1961. So again, their encounter is September 19th. Betty Hill has these dreams at the later part of September. She writes to Kehoe. Ball's rolling. Walter Webb interviews them. He's kind of blown away by them. Jackson and Homan now meet with them early November. It's just a month and a half after the event. So all of this is really rather quick. The same day that Jackson and Homan meet with the Hills, it's actually late November, so it's about 2 months later. A friend of theirs, an Air Force major named James McDonald, not the same James McDonald who's a famous UFO researcher, different guy. He was a recently retired Air Force intelligence officer, but he was a close friend of the Hills. And they had already discussed the case with him many times. So he was there. So the five of them, Jackson, Homan, Betty and Barney, and Major McDonald, are together. They discuss this encounter. They're there for 12 hours practically, during which Homan and Jackson are asking a couple of questions that really open things up. The key question that one of them asked was, "What took you so long to get home?" And this was an aha moment. So Betty and Barney realized they could not account for over 2 hours. And they were flabbergasted, in their words. So Major McDonald suggested that they undergo hypnosis. He said, why not? This was a thing. People knew about it. It was done. But at that point, no one really were able to suggest any one specific. And at this point, the threads seem to fall away a little bit. So the holiday season comes, the holiday season goes, and now we're into February 1962. And this is all because of Betty's initiative. Barney really was not pushing any of this. He was like just letting her do her thing. They started driving to the scene of their encounter. And this went on for several months. Betty was insistent about this. By March of 62, she's now looking for a psychiatrist who would use hypnotism on them. They met a doctor in March of 62 who, at the very least, ruled out hallucination on their part. So at least they had that going for them. That spring, 62. All right. Barney begins to develop a series of warts in a almost perfectly circular ring in his groin. And he's got a lot of other things going on with him physically. He's got this exhaustion happening, and he's feeling just generally lousy on a daily basis. So he actually starts seeing a psychiatrist. And throughout the entire period of this treatment, this is more than a year that he does this, he never once associated any of these problems with the UFO incident. It's very interesting to point this out. This was not on Barney's mind consciously. He really seemed to let the whole thing go. And at some point during the year, apparently he and Betty just kind of put aside the whole idea of hypnosis for their memories. And then in September 1963, we're now 2 years after the event, Betty and Barney are invited by their church to attend a discussion or to talk about their UFO experience by their church. So it's like a church group. And there's a nice picture of the two of them. This discussion was taped by one of the attendees who was a journalist. One of the other attendees was a captain named Ben Sweat of Pease Air Force Base. Again, that's in Portsmouth. And he was known locally for his study of hypnosis. So they give a talk on their encounter. It's very positively received by this church group. And the group apparently gave a lot of encouragement to Betty and Barney. And Barney mentioned the subject of this during his next session with his psychiatrist, who then recommended to him a person named Dr. Benjamin Simon. That's Benjamin Simon right there. He was a very well-known Boston psychiatrist and a neurologist. He had a great deal of experience in hypnosis. He was a true expert. And Simon, in fact, had also worked on very extensively as a chief of neuropsychiatry and was an executive officer at Mason General Hospital. That's the Army's chief psychiatric center in World War II. Benjamin Simon was very much a big deal in the psychiatric profession. So Betty and Barney Hill began to see Benjamin Simon starting at the beginning of 1964. From January through the beginning of June, they go through a number of meetings with Benjamin Simon separately. And for most of that period, it's really important to say they did not remember their experiences following the session. Simon was able to make them basically forget everything that they discussed during their sessions so that they weren't going home and talking about this to each other. It seems, as far as anyone is able to tell, that he did a completely successful job of keeping Barney's memories separate from Betty's memories during this entire hypnosis period, which lasted about nearly 6 months. Oh my goodness, there's my phone. Got to go onto silent mode here. Live stream, what are you going to do? So their sessions were separate. They were not aware of each other's unpacking of their memories in any way during this. So what we do know is that the sessions were intense. They were particularly intense for Barney. By the way, there are clips of these sessions, and it's very dramatic. It's almost upsetting when you hear particularly Barney describe what he was seeing in these sessions, and they're very easily searchable on YouTube. I would recommend you checking them out. But basically what Barney remembers under hypnosis is that he remembered, I should say, driving off of Route 3, instructed against his will by what he described as a mind voice, and instructing him to drive deep into the woods. So, and when they do that, what he remembers seeing is a kind of 6 beings in the road. This is an artist representation of it. And the craft that's above is, from everything that I've been able to understand, I don't think really was there when he saw that, but it's a nice image, right? But what he did see was 6 men standing in the road wearing dark clothing, and behind them was a bright orange glow, if not the craft, the way it's described in this image. But the men approached his car. They said, "Stay calm, close your eyes." And what Barney said under hypnosis was, "I felt like their eyes had pushed into my eyes." So they led Barney and Betty out of the car, and Barney felt his shoes dragging on the ground. That would explain the scuffs on the shoes. Anyway, they go up a ramp. They go inside a craft. He sees three men in what he describes as like an operating room, and he lays down on a table. His shoes are taken off, and a cup is placed over his groin, which he later believed that his semen was extracted at this time. Someone scraped his left arm, examined his ears and his throat, and a cylindrical device was inserted up his rectum, and someone counted his vertebrae. So Betty's story under hypnosis very closely matched her dreams from over 2 years earlier, except that in her sessions, the aliens had no hair. In her dreams, apparently they did. And in her hypnosis, they had much smaller noses than what she had in her dreams. And here's a drawing of the beings as recalled by Betty and Barney. Let's see here, years later. It's kind of a famous image. So when they're in the craft, the doctor on board takes scrapings from Betty's skin, cuts off a sample of her hair, studies her mouth, her throat, her ears, her hands, takes clippings from her fingernails, basically getting complete physical, little samples of everything. She's asked to lie down on an examination table, and the doctor pulls a machine over. One of the procedures involved what seemed like a pregnancy test, in the sense that it had a needle that was 4 to 6 inches long that was inserted into her navel. It probably wasn't an actual pregnancy test, but something happened to her where this thing was inserted into her. Later, Betty had time to speak with the leader, who seemed to communicate in English, but which she later believed was through telepathy. Anyway, she asked if she could bring something back that would prove her experience to others, and the leader agreed. He's apparently initially thought it was, why not? So she picks up a large book with these strange symbols on it, and she's forced to give that up when one of the other crew members objected to this. So she also asked the leader where he was from, and he goes to a wall and pulls down some strange map of space with stars of all these different sizes. And many of the stars were connected by broken lines or solid lines, and all of these lines were curved. And this, of course, was depicted in the famous star map drawings, and drawings plural. There were a number of these made many years after the fact. The lines, I'll come back to in a moment as to who drew this and all about that. It's quite interesting. But the lines, the leader said, represented expeditions. And he's talking a little bit about this, apparently, as Betty remembered, but then he lost interest in explaining it once he realized that Betty really didn't know any astronomy. So he said, look, you're just going to forget all about this encounter. She was determined to remember. Now, this drawing was made a few years after by a person named Marjorie Fish, who has her own interesting story in all of this. This is her. She learned about the Hill case, and she did a really remarkable job of trying to recreate exactly what in space this map depicted. And it was a lot of work. It involved very complex 3D recreations of the local star group in our galaxy. And this took many, many years. And it was Marjorie Fish's conclusion that the homeworld of the beings was the star Zeta Reticuli. It has to be said that professional astronomers ultimately found enough problems with her recreation, as impressive as it was, very impressive. Nonetheless, enough problems with her recreation that they, not surprisingly discounted. But still, well, that's kind of interesting that she's done that. And lots of individuals like Stanton Friedman, for example, as far as I know, have continued to credit the star map by Marjorie Fish. But be that as it may, let's just move back to Betty and Barney Hill here. Their accounts, if nothing else, were very consistent with each other, and I would actually say complementary to each other. So there were elements that Barney remembered that Betty didn't remember because they didn't happen to Betty, they happened to Barney, and vice versa. But they really worked perfectly well together, it seemed. Both of them described these men or these beings as about 5 feet tall, as having gray skin, as having oddly shaped heads with very broad foreheads. So again, let me just, that image of the alien being. They had large eyes, although I don't think this image really shows especially large eyes. Well, shows large, maybe not large pupils here, but large openings for the eyes. And here's an interesting little thing, that they spoke to each other with a humming sound. Now, the descriptions differed between Betty and Barney in certain little details, mostly related to the appearance of the crews. Betty said that they all wore caps. Barney only recalled the leader wearing a cap, although his conscious recollection to Webb was that all of the crew wore caps. So pretty consistent, I would say. So they're doing this hypnosis with Benjamin Simon, and eventually, he reveals all of this to them. He allows them to retain their memories under hypnosis. The fact was, Benjamin Simon, the psychiatrist, discounted any possibility of alien abduction. He just didn't believe in UFOs. And in Webb's assessment, Walter Webb, who was, of course, investigating this still, really wouldn't bother reading any relevant literature on the subject. Even when requested to read literature, he's like, nope, not really interested. What he tried to persuade the Hills was that it was Betty's initial dreams that inspired Barney's account. That part of Barney was just basically some kind of fantasy. So the Hills never believed this. They never accepted Benjamin Simon's explanation at all. Barney almost got indignant, I would say, and he pointed out, he said he had a lot of many unique elements of his account. And indeed, he said he wished the whole thing had been a hallucination, but he never believed that it was, not for an instant. The story of Betty and Barney Hill became public in 1965 after their taped conversation started to make it out and became known by journalists, particularly John Fuller in 1966, got wind of this and wrote his book about them called The Interrupted Journey, which really, you could say, cemented their place in UFO history. It's interesting to say that UFO researchers at the time gave a very mixed reaction to this whole story. Even though Walter Webb strongly endorsed the Hill case to NICAP, Kehoe, and I think the other hotshot top-level people at NICAP really didn't want to accept the fact that this was an alien abduction. All that they would accept is that the Hills saw occupants. This was the big word researchers were using at the time. They weren't really saying aliens, but occupants of the UFOs. And they thought that the whole abduction part was highly questionable. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this case is that for years, maybe even currently, but certainly for many decades, all of the debunkers of this case seem to take their main cue from Benjamin Simon himself. But no one mentioned that Simon was totally hostile to UFOs and completely ignorant about the subject of UFOs. And it's also true that Simon's theories about, or his theory of how this all happened, really could not explain why Barney felt trauma immediately after the experience. It's not that he was being influenced by Betty here. Barney was deeply upset right immediately after the experience happened. Even before Betty even had her dreams. And Simon's theory really obviously cannot account for the various pieces of physical evidence that occurred, including physiological things that were going on with Barney. You have debunkers like Philip Klass, and then later Robert Schaefer even goes so far as to endorse the whole Jupiter explanation by the Air Force. Well, I think the main problem in accepting the Hill case, at least in the 1960s, was the fact that it was so novel, so new. Stories of alien abductions were unknown in 1961. Even among UFO researchers, even then, they were used to dealing with the unconventional, right? But this seemed just a little bit too far out. The problem was it was very obvious that Betty and Barney Hill were not hoaxing. And it's equally obvious they were not crazy. They were not looking for publicity. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the fact that they were an interracial couple in the early 1960s, I think this becomes a bit more relevant here. And in fact, the Blue Book episode that covered this case did not portray them that way. They were they were both an African-American couple, which, a lot of people have wondered, well, why did they do that? And I don't really have a good answer for that, so I'm not going to try. But in the early 1960s, interracial couples were definitely unusual. And the fact was that Betty and Barney did not want negative, ridiculing publicity. They were extremely solid members of their community. They were involved in civil rights. They didn't want to make themselves appear foolish to a skeptical world. And actually, most UFO witnesses and most people who have UFO experiences are actually solid members of their community. This is more often the case than not. You have very few sketchy fringe people who actually talk about these experiences. Some, yes, sure, but many, I would say most, are very solid individuals, and Betty and Barney Hill were just two more examples of that. They knew what happened to them. During the 1970s, as the abduction phenomenon became more widely claimed and more widely discussed and acknowledged, I think what happened is that the case of Betty and Barney Hill seemed increasingly plausible to more and more people. I mean, if you concede the existence of UFOs as the product of something non-human, a non-human intelligence, and if you concede the possibility of occupants or aliens in at least some of the craft, I would say it's hard to accept anything other than the obvious, that Betty and Barney Hill were abducted by aliens. Barney sadly died in 1969. I think it's believed that the stress of the publicity and the experience itself probably possibly contributed to his early death. I believe he was not even 50 years old when he died. Very, very unfortunate. I think he was 46 years old. Now, Betty made it into the 21st century. And actually, I can say I was lucky enough to meet her very early in my career in the UFO field. I got to sit down with Betty Hill. That's in 2002 at the MUFON Symposium, happened to be in Rochester, New York. And that bust, that head on Betty's lap is a 3D recreation of the alien being that she and Barney saw. And she did a variety of many, many public appearances with that, as well as the dress she wore that night. She would bring that with her. There was an attempt to study the dress itself and look for any kind of damage. And I believe Kathleen Marden has something to say about that on her website. But anyway, what I found about Betty Hill was that even in her advanced years, she was a very straightforward, very sharp individual indeed. Rather impressive, I have to say. I was very, very pleased to meet Betty Hill. And after meeting her, felt much more convinced that she was a very solid individual, and I think quite believable. I would say that the Hill abduction case is quite difficult to explain away. If you don't believe in UFOs, and the only thing you've got for this is that they were somehow delusional or greatly mistaken, but the kind of delusion and mistake that they would have had to have made seems really beyond what is credible to expect of two very reliable, responsible people. It doesn't make any sense to me. And if it makes sense to you, then, well, you're going to have to explain to me how it does, because no one has ever really critiqued their honesty and, what they seem to remember. I think they were very truthful. So it seems to me very implausible that they were delusional. Now, if you do credit that UFOs are some kind of reality, well, then it's not really that much of a stretch, is it? Seems to me that something happened to them, something done by someone not from around here. So that's essentially all that I've got to say about the Betty and Barney Hill case. Again, I would highly recommend you go to the website of Kathleen Marden or get her book, Captured. Very fine book indeed, if you are interested in more information about the Hill case. But I thought what I'd wanted to do here is give a good synopsis of it and put in some interesting visuals for it to the extent that I can. So hope you found that interesting. Next week when I do, I will finish up this little Blue Book mini-series that I've been doing, and I will talk about the Washington sightings of 1952, and they were indeed quite fascinating. That's for sure. And again, as I said, excuse me, on Tuesday, Tracy and I will be back together, and we'll do another intelligent disclosure. I will have some interviews going for the Richard Dolan show. Look for a series of interviews, I believe, with Frank Ficino, who has some very interesting things to say relating to the year 1952 and the Flatwoods Monster case, and I think quite a bit more. So that's it. I want to thank you for being here. If you like what you see, I would absolutely ask you and encourage you to please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me a lot. I'm doing everything that I can to bring this channel up to as many subscribers as possible. And the reason is very simple. It helps the UFO field, in my view, that we get as much mainstream attention as possible. And the fact is that mainstream individuals don't like to look at us if our websites are too small or if our YouTube channels are too small. So if you really believe in what we do, if you believe in what I do, please like and subscribe to the channel. And by subscribing, you can get notifications. And if you do that, you'll be less likely to miss new shows that come out as they do come out. So there's that. We have a weekly newsletter. It's Richard Dolan members newsletter, but anyone can subscribe to it. It's free. You can go to Richard Dolan members or richarddolanpress.com and just click subscribe, and it'll give you a pretty good update of what Tracy and I are up to every week. We do have the members site. Go to Richard Dolan members, and there's even more information there, quite a lot more. I'm producing things every week. So that's what I'm up to, and I hope you've enjoyed this. I want to thank you very much for coming out, and we'll see you again real soon. Later.